Ladies and gentlemen, if we can begin. Welcome and good morning. My name is Charles Cadwell. I'm one of the vice presidents here at the Urban Institute in charge of international development and governance. It's my pleasure to join with the World Bank in welcoming you to this discussion. To those of you in the room, but also those who are joining us on the internet via the webcast. Today we're happy to have partnered with the World Bank as they launch a new report toward Great Dhaka, a new urban development paradigm eastward. Today's discussion will start with the report, and that would warrant lots and lots of time, but we're going to ask our experts and you to do two things: to consider the report and the contribution it makes to thinking about Dhaka, but also its relevance of this approach to many more cities and circumstances beyond Dhaka and beyond Bangladesh. That's a lot to pack in. I want to make sure that we have time for your questions and comments, so we're going to push along. One program note, Gloria Steele, who's the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Europe-Asia Bureau, USAID, can't be with us today on account of the shutdown. She's a leader at USAID in focusing on urban issues, both in her current role and her role when she was the mission director in the Philippines. So it's a loss to us today. Here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to start with a short video summary of the report and about Dhaka and the motivation for the report, followed by brief remarks from the lead author, an economist, Hua Li, who has 8 slides that she will go through expeditiously to illustrate the main issues in the report. I'll then ask our 2 remaining panelists to join us up on the dais, and we'll have a short discussion about that. We've got another panelist who can only be with us by video, Martin Rama, who was the chief economist for the South Asia region at the bank until recently. I think he's in Sri Lanka. Any event, he's in Asia someplace. For those of you watching online, you should feel free to submit questions at any point. Simply send an email to events@urban.org, and they will find their way up to the front of the room. Following the panel discussion, we'll have, I'm determined to leave plenty of time for discussion and questions so that we can adjourn by 10:30. When we first started talking with the bank about this report, I was wondering about, well, what's the relevance of this special circumstance in Bangladesh, where there's this East Dhaka zone that happens to be relatively undeveloped, to other places, even here in the U.S. And indeed, in developed countries, many cities are facing shrinking, not growing populations. But as today approached, I was thinking about the trade-offs that the bank has covered in this report. It occurred to me that with climate makes many urban areas, even in cities familiar to us, uninhabitable, forcing us to take account of the trade-offs of opening up new space as populations have to make that decision. Can we retrofit where we are, or do we move? So even in a rich country where the spatial, fiscal issues arise, it may be that it will remind us someday when we think back to that day in early 2019 when we were looking on as the World Bank launched this report. Here at Urban, we've worked on urban issues and many others since our founding in 1968. And indeed, we celebrate our 50th birthday this year. In that regard, I should note that today's meeting is one of the last meetings in this room. We're moving in mid-March, and I forget the exact number, but we're, if not the last, close to the last meeting. We're moving to a new building, new space, and hopefully we can welcome all of you to a snazzy, flexible, technologically up-to-date advanced meeting space at 500 L'Enfant Plaza soon. As you know, Urban is mainly a domestically focused think tank. But since the 1980s, we've worked in some 70 countries around the globe as well. We don't have the World Bank's resources. We don't have the World Bank's scope. But we do research and work with local leaders on issues in dozens of countries that I think integrate well with today's report. Of particular relevance, we recently looked at obstacles to service delivery in 42 cities of South Asia and Africa, focusing on the governance, the discretion, the accountability, and the collaborative capacity of local leaders. We've been looking at the political economy of smart cities in India and Indonesia. An urban team looked at transport safety for women and its effect on the size of labor markets and their ability to participate. A different team looked at the effects of climate change on women in urban areas in South Asia. Kenya, Tanzania, other places we're working on these issues. So it's a particular pleasure to work with the World Bank on today's event. In this work, our interests are twofold. First of all, what are the policy issues? But as importantly, what are the governance issues that affect whether or not good ideas become good policy? All these issues are present in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And the new approach that the bank has developed warrants our attention in this morning's program. So as we move into this topic, I hope that the conversation helps all of us think about two things. One, is this realistic for Dhaka? And is this approach useful for others? So I want to start by playing this short video, and then we'll move into our speakers. And here we go.
Let's imagine a Dhaka where everyday life is easy. A Dhaka where commuting to work is quick. Let's imagine a Dhaka where everyday life is easy. A Dhaka where commuting to work is quick. Taking children to school is safe, and making it to the hospital before it's too late is possible. A more livable Dhaka is everybody's aspiration. So far, efforts have not succeeded. But a unique opportunity lies just across, within walking distance to the east. This vast green area is comparable in size with a major European city. However, the opportunity offered by East Dhaka is in serious jeopardy. Every day, developers are pumping in large amounts of sand, filling in natural wetlands, and raising the ground for construction. Without decisive action, most of East Dhaka will remain vulnerable to flooding. The area will also become messy and congested like the west of the city. Fixing East Dhaka in the future will be difficult and expensive. The time to act is now. To seize the opportunity East Dhaka offers, 3 things should be done. First, an embankment must be built on the Balu River to prevent flooding from rising water. Second, good transport links integrating East and West Dhaka would help residents move around quickly and safely and reduce congestion throughout the city. And third, a new business district with high-quality infrastructure and policies should be established to attract companies and residents eastward. These 3 interventions will help Dhaka's residents enjoy a future with a higher quality of life and more opportunities. more and better jobs will be created, and the average income per capita in Dhaka could exceed $9,000 by year 2035. With the 3 interventions, Dhaka can become a great city, one where everyday life is easy. Existing projects show that bold urban interventions are possible in Bangladesh. This vision can become reality. Let's make it happen.
To explain how the bank has come to analyze this opportunity, we've got Hua Li, who's the lead author on the report. Her biomaterials are in the handout you had, so I don't want to spend our scarce time reviewing it, but I do hope that you've scanned it already so you can give her your full attention now. Hua.
Thanks, Chas, for the very nice introduction. And good morning, everyone. My name is Hua Li, as mentioned by Chas, from the World Bank, more specifically from the Chief Economist Office for South Asia region. And today, our new Chief Economist, Hans Timmer, is also with us here. And before my presentation, I first want to thank Urban Institute for collaborating with us and hosting this exciting debate here so seamlessly. And also want to thank everyone for joining us both physically and online for a stimulating discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. 10 minutes, I won't be able to cover the full report. I just want to use 6 slides to talk about 4 key issues and complement the video. First is about Dhaka as a fast-growing megacity to set the stage for the report and for also later debate. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit more about this unique opportunity mentioned in the video. And then I want to move on to explain how we identify those interventions and build kind of simulation or scenarios based on those identified interventions. And finally, how we apply relatively advanced economic tools to make predictions of those simulations in terms of spatial distribution of economic benefits and the cost to help policymakers to make judgment of potential policies and interventions. With that, let me start. So this first slide, I want to talk a little bit more about Dhaka. For those who don't know much about the city, it's the capital of Bangladesh, and it's truly a fast-growing megacity. Its population grew from about 13 million in 1981 to over 80 million in 2015. With that, it stands as the 11th largest city in the world, and it continues to grow at about 3 to 4% a year. And also in our report, we show that this growth stands on good economic fundamentals, including location advantages, agglomeration effects, and self-selection of productive firms and talented people. So in the slides, I want to just show you how, as a result of the good economic fundamentals, the city has generated vibrant economic forces. We know that measure, economic activity at the city scale is difficult because the size. So follow the economics literature. We use nighttime lights, which are available from satellite image at 500 to 500 scale to aggregate up and a proxy for the economic activity for Great Dhaka. That's what you saw in this you see now in these two maps. The map on your left is the map showing nighttime intensity for 2012, and the one on the right shows the same information for 2016. And two maps are same scale. So yellow represents dimmer light, and green and finally blue represent bright light. As you can see, within the 5 years, economic activity has increased very fast in Great Dhaka area. According to our calculation, the speed is about 12% a year. And to give you a context, the country grew at 6% a year. And but unfortunately, when people and business gather together, we know that conglomeration congestion forces also arrive at the same time. In Dhaka's case, its urban development has been relying on markets, on individual efforts, especially since its independence. So it's an organic process. This organic process delivered, as we saw in this map and among other figures, but at the same time, it can only deliver to a certain point. So right now, the city suffers from flooding, congestion, and messiness. So we know that the interplay of agglomeration effects and congestion forces can put the city on different trajectory. In a way, in an analytical term, Dhaka is at a point that looking forward to new solutions, new thinking to kind of release the city from outside the congestion forces and reach a new general equilibrium. So that's the context of our report. With that, I want to move on to talk a little more about this unique opportunity. And in thinking of the potential new strategy or solution for Dhaka's urban development, we review some of the previous proposals, including waterfront revitalization, brownfield regeneration. All of them have merits, but at the same time, they focus on retrofitting West Dhaka, which, if you remember the previous map, is on the west of the core of the city in the middle, and it's the most densely developed. And it hasn't been effective despite being expensive, as you saw in the video. With that, we thought starting anew might be an alternative strategy to meet the growing demand of the city while retrofitting efforts are being implemented in West Dhaka. So as you with that, we're trying to looking for what are the potential places to start anew. There are different proposals, many are more like a satellite city development. Meanwhile, there is East Dhaka. As you saw in this map, it's the area highlighted in yellow. It's next to some of the most affluent part of the city, like Gurgaon, like Tangjing industrial area, but also at the size of 100 square kilometers. So it's a really decent size, has the potential to tap into the existing agglomeration effects and forces in West Dhaka, while at the same time release the land pressure, population growth pressure. And of course, the data and information for Dhaka is still kind of in its preliminary stage, and there's no concrete, information on how East Dhaka can deliver for the city. So we thought in this aspect, the example of Pudong, Shanghai is quite relevant. For people who know about Shanghai, you probably know that Shanghai is called the Paris of East in the 1930s and the global city for trade and finance now. But perhaps not many people know that in between Shanghai, the takeoff, as the new global cities really started in 1990s and start in its least developed part, Pudong. If you look at these two figures, first focus on the top one, which was taken before 1990, the reform or the development of Pudong. And Pudong area is the area on top of the photo and above the river. That's the Huangpu River, divides the city into two parts. As you can see, maybe it's a little bit vague, but in the book you can see a clear picture that it's pretty much rural with limited, industrial factories for port services. But at the same time, across this river, like 500 meter wide, is Puxi area, which is what you generally know, the French Concession, the Bond area, the most affluent part of the city. So, started with the city idea and elevated into national strategy. Pudong was, developed since the 1990s. After about a quarter of a century, Pudong has transformed in what you see now in the second photo in the bottom, supported by skyscrapers, center for trade and finance. So basically, rural land, not just literally being close to affluent part, but also because of the concrete implementation of urban development ideas really transformed and lead to the growth of the whole city. So that indicate the potential of East Dhaka for Dhaka. It's kind of a real example. At the same time, it's debatable how the experience can be transferred from Shanghai to Dhaka, from Pudong to East Dhaka. We understand that, and we also know that institutions is extremely weak in that setting. So we're thinking we need to adapt the Pudong idea, Pudong approach into East Dhaka. For that, we rely on existing studies and plans to identify interventions that can address the three key challenges faced by Dhaka now. That's what you saw in the video, and all of them are based on existing studies done for East Dhaka or for Dhaka. As an example, the first one in terms of addressing flooding is based on several technical studies done by Institution of Water Modeling of Bangladesh. And also, when thinking about what those interventions can be implemented in relationship to each other, we classify them according to how hard it is to implement each of them. In general, we think of reforms, soft reforms, as easy and soft because they don't require lump sum investment as hard, large infrastructure, and it can be adjusted along the way. But in terms of implementation, we think it's the other way around because soft reforms, you need higher capacity. So we classify those interventions along that order. Basically, east embankment and auxiliary measures are relatively easy to be implemented by being a hard infrastructure investment, and the soft reforms toward stimulating private investment, protecting environment are harder. And then we combine them along that order. So construct 4 scenarios. So the first scenario basically assume productivity, population, skills will grow at the current rate. At the same time, public efforts focus on retrofitting at the west part as it is now. And then the second scenario, add the east embankment on. The third one, add transportation networks, mass transit, and the last one, combine soft reforms, constitute a strategic approach. But still, those are the assumptions and based on plans, studies, and we know that many plans were not implemented in Dhaka. Then also, although the experience and the gains from Pudong is impressive, it's still Shanghai Pudong. So how can we quantify those scenarios, quantify the potential economic impact of those interventions across the 4 scenarios, and to help the policymakers to thinking about the trade-off of different interventions or different scenarios. So that come to the last 2 slides. Here, I want to explain how we quantify it, how we make the prediction very briefly. Basically, we apply a spatial general equilibrium model to Dhaka setting. This type of model build on the general equilibrium tradition of the trust, but adds the geospatial element to it. It's basically divide the city into different cells and the modeling firm behavior, household behavior in the context of the characteristics like land areas, distance of each of the cell, and the relationship between the cell, especially in terms of transportation cost. So give you an example. Traditionally in the general equilibrium model, a firm would make decisions on how much inputs, whether skilled or unskilled labor, which sector to work in, tradable services or manufacture, and also how much to buy from other sectors and to produce. But in this model, firm also need to make a decision on where to locate, in considering the wage cost of that location, in terms of the land rent of that location, and also how much it costs to move goods around to other places, and the community cost of its workers. So that model's additional value is really in its capacity to predict spatial distribution of economic activities. And this type model can be suitable for any city. Based on our knowledge, it hasn't been applied much even in advanced economies. So this is really a special case. And to make it work for Dhaka, we use granular spatial data as good as it can be, and work with a team from Oxford and fit the model to Dhaka, and then realistically build those simulations. With that, we're able to make predictions on population, on number of jobs, type of jobs for different areas of the city. With that, I want to conclude, and thanks for your time.
For those of you who have not had the opportunity to read the report, I can assure you there's a lot in it. It covers, as I read it, each page raised a question, and a couple of pages later it was clear that they had thought about it. But having said that, the report doesn't solve all problems that East Dhaka will face. But I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the report and give our panelists, Indermit Gill and Amar Malik, a chance to make some brief comments on the report before we widen out to think about the more general challenge for the cities. Indermit, you led the World Bank's 2009 agglomeration economics report that was path-breaking at its time, that made people think differently about urbanization and sort of put urbanization more higher on the bank's agenda. Is this report consistent? Does it advance on what you did those several years ago? What's your reaction?
So my first reaction is that actually I really like the report a lot. I guess I was trying to sort of think about if I'm happy to be here or not, and I'm very happy to be here because I don't have to lie about the report. You're normally really uncomfortable when you have to say that you really like a report that you didn't. This is a really nicely written report. It's very well researched and it's very well written, right? Now, having said that, it does say some things that we wouldn't have said back in 2009. And I think part of the reason for that is that what we now know a lot more about what has happened in China since 2009, right? And basically what the report tries to sort of do is try to get those lessons from China and see how they can be applied in other parts of the world that actually look quite different from China's, right? But I do have some quibbles about it, and I would like to sort of show a few slides about it, but I can wait for that.
Okay, yeah, we have those queued up a bit later. We'll come back to that.
Yep.
So do you agree with the recommendations in the report?
No, well, I do agree with about half of them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with the others, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why when I show you the
Okay,
slides.
if this were baseball, you'd be doing well at batting 500. Amar, you've worked on all sorts of models of urban change, on transport design, on urban service delivery, so I'm sure you've got a lot to say, but could you start by talking about urban service delivery? I know Bangladesh was one of the 14 countries you looked at, and what guidance or perspective does that work give you on the report here.
Thank you, Jazz. I think the first thing I'll say is that the title of the event, I think, is interesting. It's provocative. For me, it clarifies a lot of things because it's sort of a planner's dream to build anew. You can make your grids and all that. But from an economic perspective, it creates a lot of these questions about equity issues, about labor markets accessibility, and so I think it's a fantastic framing for us to consider some of these things. What we did in that service delivery project that Chaz mentioned was basically build a tool that we then applied to 42 cities across 14 countries, mainly in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa, including in Bangladesh. So what we did was we looked at 5 elements of what we thought was good local governance. First was the effectiveness of functional assignment. So does the legal authority of a local government match with the reality of what they're supposed to deliver? How dynamic is the local political leadership and how much political space they have? Administrative autonomy, which means does the mayor have the power to hire and fire people who are delivering water services? Often those things are mixed up, and the report talks a lot about that. And then financial autonomy, do you have the right to raise revenues when you need to, and so on. And the final thing was accountability and participation of citizens in budgeting and in local governance and local decisions. And again, this framework really enables us to understand where different countries stand. It's not a be and all of how good or bad a governance system is. But when we compared Bangladesh, according to this tool, we found that it out of the 14 that we had picked, it scored in the top 5, along with countries like Philippines and Indonesia, but better than countries like Pakistan and Kenya, where local government don't have much capacity and much space to do things. But having said that, as we'll discuss in the second half of the panel, I think that does raise a lot of questions about especially how the coordination of all of this will happen. I mean, it sounds good enough to try to build anew, but it has to interact with existing governance systems. Should we go in the sort of a radical direction of charter city and bring in new laws, etc.? What's going to happen to local communities? What's the impact on natural ecosystems, etc.? Because this is, after all, rural land. So it does raise a number of questions, which I hope we can go into.
In that vein, Yue, in the report you talk about. You anticipate these governance issues, and you're talking about your messiness and the fragmented governance in Dhaka. And we've got examples of lots of ambitious new city plans in China. I know the mayor of Korea talked about challenges in this room at an event we did. China, where there are ghost cities, basically, where somebody had an idea for how to anticipate expansion and build something, but nobody came. How does East Dhaka different, or how's your thinking about that?
So first, so I can see the kind of 2 type of questions. One is on whether this East Dhaka idea is just planning idea, right? So we come in and tell government you should do that or not, or whether the market has spoken or not. So the second question is, even if the market has spoken, how about the governance issue? So let me start with the first. I didn't get time to talk in the slides, but in the video you saw that the private sector, especially large investors, have been grabbing land, filling it with sand to mitigate the flooding risks in a very partial and non-sustainable way. In that way, it shows the vitality of the market, that because the land is so close to existing part that is vibrant and valuable, the market has seized the value, has started development. And also, I didn't get a chance to emphasize here, but it's in the report, is there this type of private sector land development has serious risks. The social risk, as you were mentioning, the basically target middle income or higher income level people, and build gated communities for them. Secondly, there's the sustainability issue, the increased risks in terms of both flooding and earthquakes because of geological condition of the city. And thirdly, their service deliveries are not even. They're basically replicating what's happening in the West. So you have the risk that the East will turn into West Dhaka, and then we don't don't have available land to really change the city or put it on a new growth path. So that's how we come into and thinking it's a unique opportunity, but also the opportunity is losing fast. And then second, quickly on the governance issue is in the report also, as you mentioned, it may not be the worst because South Asian and African cities really suffer from fragmented institutions. So as we saw, Dhaka is devastating, the institutional situation, but it's, according to Amar's study, it's actually not the worst. It's just one of the examples. At the same time, there are examples of successful urban development. It's if you saw again at the end of the video, that's the Hataji Lake Integrated Urban Development Project. For that, the project has a relatively clear mandate from the Prime Minister itself, and also have a relatively strong development agency to coordinate all parts of the work, land reclamation, and infrastructure project, and traffic control. So that actually delivered. So there is hope that maybe some purpose-built institutions can address some of the issue and deliver in this area. So that's our general thought.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to the Martin Rama's intervention, any comments from the two of you on this?
So I guess the first thing that I'm realizing is that one should never agree to comment about a report about a place that you haven't been to. So I haven't been to Dhaka, and by way of explanation, why I'm here is because Yue came to me last week and said that she had written a report on Dhaka, and would I like to comment on it? And I never say no to her. And I thought that she had written a report about the dreamers, right? Because she said Dhaka. So I agreed, and then it was too late for me to back out. So I'm not going to talk too much about Dhaka itself. My main.
When you talk about the dreamers, maybe you can solve the shutdown thing.
I know. But my main reaction to the report was that when I looked at the sequence of things that the report was recommending, to put it a little oversimplified way, the sequence of policies proposed by the report are, the first one is to actually say that there should be an intervention, which would be an infrastructural intervention, which is that to 26-kilometer long embankment. The second one would be that you would have a lot of infrastructure investments, basically transport, especially metropolitan transport. And then the third one would be, again, an intervention, essentially trying to sort of bring in innovative activities, bring in high-skilled jobs and so on into this area. So now the thing that we said in the World Development Report was you should always start with institutions. You should start with this foundation of improving institutions. The second thing you should do is then you should start to think about what is the best place or which are the best places to build infrastructure. And then the third, if necessary, then you have targeted interventions. So in that sense, what the report does is that it actually violates that sequence, and that's why I'm a bit uncomfortable with the report.
We can have lots of conversation about that. But let me cue up the short video intervention by Martin Rama, who's not with us today, but sort of helps us broaden this discussion. Let me pretend to do that.
Supposed to point at that window, she said. There you go.
Good morning in Washington. Good evening from South Asia, where I am now. I'm very sorry that I cannot join you in person.
Can we start this over with the volume higher?
With you through this video. My name is Martin Rama. Good morning in Washington. Good evening from South Asia, where I am now. I'm very sorry that I cannot join you in person, but delighted to be here with you through this video. My name is Martin Rama. I was the chief economist for South Asia when this report about Dhaka that my colleague Hua Li just presented was produced, and I'm still working with the region. And while I could not enjoy the discussion you have had so far, because I was at a panel discussion with South Asian students in Colombo at the same time when you will be seeing this video. I'm very grateful to the Urban Institute and to all of you for joining this discussion. And I would like to contribute just a few thoughts on how to transition from the Dhaka case study, its implications, its methodology, to the broader concern that is in the title of this event, which is the big question, whether to retrofit or to build anew. In a way, is a question that is much more pressing in developing countries than in advanced economies, because in developing countries where a lot of the urbanization is taking place. But we still believe that the question is broad, is general, and that from your expertise, from your point of view, you may have interesting insights in that respect. And so as we move to the second part of the discussion, there are three issues which I think merit attention. And I will put them under the broad heading of economics, governance, and sustainability. On economics, the case of Dhaka, we are quite comfortable with our simulations, but I guess the big question is, where is that the payoffs are highest? Clearly, retrofitting is more expensive, is more laborious, but it tends to be done in parts of the city that are more dense and in a way may have more potential. If urbanization started there, it was probably for some good reason. And so one of the questions, especially when it comes to density, is how people see this trade-off between a cheaper solution, but that may result in perhaps lower economic density, and a much more costly solution in areas where density may already be at levels close to saturation. My impression is that in many parts, the old parts of the city will remain the most valuable ones, but the question is how much is the gain that one gets by adding vast expanses of land, even if the economic density is not as high, as opposed to densifying what is already dense. So that's a first question on the economics. On the governance, a problem we have faced in the case of Dhaka, and I think it's more general, is that there is not a voting constituency or a political constituency for building anew. Well, as we were dealing with the mayors of Dhaka, their concern were the next elections, and their voters were in the existing city, not in the other potential city. I think it's not by chance that Shanghai was a national project. The development of Pudong was a national project, even more than a city project. We even face similar problems when dealing with our operational counterparts in the bank. They tell us they like the idea, but they need counterparts to work with in the country. And these places where one can build anew, which can be rural, don't have counterparts that have the means, the capacity, the interest in going in that direction. So that's from the governance point of view, whether it's not just it's profitable, but where it's politically feasible. And the third concern is sustainability. We know that with climate change, new vulnerabilities will emerge, especially for coastal cities, but not only for them. And one of the questions is whether building anew will allow to address these vulnerabilities that come from climate change better than retrofitting. So these are the three questions that if I was in the panel with you today, I will be posing, and I will be eager to tap your brains, to pick your brains, and know what you think about them. Thanks again for having me.
Very succinct. We should thank you to Martin Rama. So I guess the question is whether the approach has legs. I appreciate the way Martin talked about how to think about the trade-offs between the two approaches, the retrofitting or building anew. And I guess to focus on the question he asked was, it's not just what those trade-offs are, but how existing leaders see their trade-offs. and what role they see themselves playing in implementation. Because in Dhaka, there's a Dhaka South and a Dhaka North with two separate mayors who have they're mayors for a reason. They got elected, they have constituencies, et cetera. And so, and I'm confident that in other places where this model might be applied, there's going to be similar sorts of very specific, not concrete, but specific constraints on the ground that have to be dealt with in implementing these sorts of ideas. Amar, you and I were talking earlier about your thoughts on the things that are either haven't been brought up yet or in this model that you think would be important to take into account as we consider how to export this beyond Dhaka.
I really like the framing that Martin presented. I think it does encapsulate a lot of the issues we've been talking about. But one thing that concerns me, and when I think of this, is I also worry about like the King Abdullah Financial Center in Riyadh, where it's basically, for now, it's a ghost town. It's like a massive, very nice infrastructure with a metro line, but no takers. And in that market, I know this is a different environment, but in that market, I'm not sure if the authorities have really done a proper model that tells us if the market is actually ready to take up if there are takers for that office space. It also, my mind goes back to this idea that cities are essentially labor markets, which Alain Berthaud in his new book has emphasized quite a bit. And that takes my mind back to the 1950s in Karachi in Pakistan, when after independence a lot of people were migrants from what is now India were basically living in slum-like conditions in the middle of the city. And the solution that was brought in was that outside in the suburbs of the city, we'll build this very nice new communities, social housing, bring people out. It'll be you'll have a small house and a backyard and a market and here and there. And Steve Inskeep in his book Instant City talks about this very, very interesting phenomena where it took only 5 to 7 years for everybody to be all the way back, because it wasn't a fully integrated system. The transportation network wasn't there. People didn't have jobs in the area. So the idea that you can actually move a bunch of people outside the city without having those ancillary investments and creating the jobs isn't going to work. But having said that, I understand that the modeling exercise here really gives very good scenarios, and it does show that there is demand in the market to take that on. And the one thing that I worry about is equity, and especially as I think of housing and the interaction of where people will live and where they will end up. To what extent will East Dhaka be able to accommodate for middle and low income people? Because even if we have, if we assume that there is a commuting culture where younger, sort of the creative class types will move into this area, they need domestic helpers, they need service providers, etc. And if those people are going to continue living in West Dhaka, I know it's only 6 kilometers as the report notes, but will people have access to the BRT systems that we're proposing? Will the BRTs be subsidized? Will the subsidies be targeted, etc.? So I just want to say that for me, equity, both urban poor, women, and disabled people, I think those are concerns that we should consider even as we think of these grand proposals.
Martin, you had some thoughts about the China example in particular. Are they relevant here?
I have tons of things to say. I don't know how to organize it, because when Martin was talking, he was saying that it's no problem. He was saying that West Dhaka is already dense, and when you look at the maps of South Asia's density, you realize that actually West Dhaka is not dense. It's congested, but that's very different from it being dense. The second thing that struck me was that Dhaka appears to be the most vulnerable in terms of natural disasters and so on of the top 4 cities in Bangladesh. So then the question arises, do you invest in the most vulnerable place or do you invest in a thing? And then the third one was that when you sort of looked at the first part of the report, especially on page 10, there's a very nice chart which says that Bangladesh has few sizable secondary cities. And it looks at Zipf's law, and it says that in Bangladesh, actually, Zipf's law does not hold. Now, roughly speaking, what that means is that the Bangladeshi government has not done enough to make markets work well, right? Because basically, if markets work well, then the second largest city in Bangladesh would be half the size of Dhaka, the third largest city would be 1/3 the size of Dhaka, and so on. So what Dhaka really lacks is the fact that it doesn't have enough secondary cities, large enough secondary cities. So you're thinking about Khulna and Chittagong and others and so on. So the question that comes up, of course, is, and this is a question that is not answered by the report, even though the report does answer a whole lot of questions that I think should be answered. The question it doesn't answer is whether or not should a national strategy prioritize East Dhaka, or should it prioritize Chittagong or Khulna or some other place and so on, right? So that's one thing. The second thing, and the way that I see that as a blind spot for the report, because you look at the report and there's not a single map that has Bangladesh as a whole. It's always just Dhaka, and I think I have a feeling that the authors of the report, even though they're talking about a national strategy, they ended up focusing too soon on Dhaka, right? So that's one thing. I do think now I'm slightly afraid of being too critical, because I really like the report too, right? And basically, I like the report because it answers the questions that it said it would. But like all good reports, it actually raises many questions that it doesn't answer, which is fine, right? So it answers the question about how can Dhaka be improved and expanded, what will happen if the government goes about its business, what happens if you put an embankment, what happens if you put in metropolitan transport, etc., etc. My problem there is that it falls a little bit short there, because it doesn't talk about land markets, right? It doesn't talk about labor markets. It doesn't talk about capital markets. And maybe those are the kind of things that one should start with, right? That's one. Now, the other part of it is that exactly as I said, since we're talking about national priorities, it would be good to also sort of compare this with investments in places like Chittagong, in places like Khulna, and so on. And then the last bit, and this comes to the part about using the example of Pudong. The question about Pudong versus Puxi, which is the part of Shanghai from where all those pictures are taken, by the way, Puxi is was actually pretty well run, right? So it wasn't as much of a thing saying that because we can't run Puxi well, let's build Pudong, right? It was actually, they could manage Puxi really well, and that's why they built Pudong, right? So maybe that question needs to be answered too, in the sense that if you can't manage a city of X million well, can you manage a city of 2X million well, right? And I think the answer to that usually is no, right?
Do you want to use your slides?
Can I?
Yes.
Can I? Okay. I can actually stand there and do it. It might just be a little better. Oops.
No, you have to sit here, I'm afraid.
I do have to sit here?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
You're tethered.
Sorry. What do? I do this?
There you
go. Okay. So it's I guess these are small charts, and the reason why I'm showing you this is because these are two very different places, right? So the first place, the one that Yue also showed you, is Pudong. And that's the picture that everybody sees, right? And this is the reason why I said that it's really important to actually have visited a place on which you're commenting, right? So I've actually spent some time in Shanghai. And the second part, by the way, is Puxi. This is the part, this would be the equivalent of West Dhaka, right? So Pudong is the equivalent of East Dhaka. And the picture that you see on the other side looks really messy and so on. But if you actually go to Shanghai, and if you had to pick between spending a day over there on the left side or on the right side, you'd pick the right every time. Okay, you'd pick the right. Okay, and now, so I have a Chinese friend who's actually a Shanghainese person. His name is James Wen. He used to teach at He used to teach at Trinity College in Connecticut, and he actually makes a really good case to the contrary, in the sense that he actually says that it's Puxi that is the much more impressive place, right? And his argument is about density, it's about institutions, and it's about efficient connectivity, right? So here's what he says. So he goes back in time when Shanghai had actually very different institutions. So between 1945 and 1950, Shanghai Puxi actually, because there was no Pudong, right? Puxi had private ownership of land, it had no restrictions on land sales, and it had no restrictions on migrants entering to work and live in the city, okay, for 5 years, right? It used property taxes for public finance, and it used the transactions tax when land changed hands, right? Now, during this time, its built area remained the same. It was 86.7 square kilometers. That didn't change. But its population went from 2.8 million to 4.2 million, okay? So the city became 50% more dense, right? From 3,200 people per square kilometer to 32,000 people per square kilometer to 48,000, right? Okay. Now you fast forward to Communist China, where there are no real land markets. Now between 2000 and 2010, Pudong went through a similar period of growth, right? But under very different conditions, right? The population doubled from 2.4 million to 5 million. But the government had monopoly rights to buy land from farmers and monopoly rights to supply land to developers, right? And the built area more than tripled. So the population doubled, the built area tripled, okay? It went from 102 square kilometers to 340 square kilometers, right? So if you take a look at this chart, for example, it tells you which is, it contrasts the density of the two places, Puxi and Pudong, right? Now, you have to have been to these places to realize that you'd rather live in the dense place, not in the non-dense place, okay? All right, now, so basically what has happened in Pudong is that the population density actually fell by 40%, okay? It went from 24,000 to 15,000 person per square kilometer, right? Okay, now, you said this, and this was the point that Amar also made, which is that when you're thinking about a city, you're not just thinking about its efficiency, you're not just thinking about its size, you're also thinking about how inclusive it is, right? And so basically what you find is that because Pudong's infrastructure is much better than its institutions in a sense, because you don't have land markets and so on, you contrast this with Puxi. Now, even, take a look at Puxi's spatial structures. Because of something that happened 50, 60 years back, right, Puxi's spatial structures are still more efficient, okay? It creates 21,500 jobs per square kilometer compared to 6,500 jobs in Pudong, okay? Now, it turns out that old Puxi is also a lot more inclusive. So if you look, for example, there are only 2 million migrants who live in Pudong, and there are 7 million that live in other parts of Shanghai, including Puxi, so on, right? Now you go back to those landscapes, right, these ones here. Go back to these landscapes and say, which one do you like more? Okay? Now, and so I'm not saying that you should have only one or the other, but what I'm saying is, what do you fix first? That's really the key.
You've raised a whole host of issues. The challenge you gave, you retrofitted to the report here, I think is broader than they may have started out to resolve, and that is the fact that East Dhaka is developing. And so the choice isn't, there's certainly issues elsewhere in Bangladesh, but if the choice is to let East Dhaka develop in an ad hoc way on sand, or to put some basic infrastructure in that makes the trade-offs more explicit. In the report, they go through some considerable detail on the cost and the benefits. If you can, and you haven't created a sliding scale, Yue, to say, well, if you only get this done between your three big scenarios, but the cost-benefit advantage of doing something other than the status quo is just huge, and the issue is, can we pick those dollars up off the sidewalk? But Yue, do you have any reaction to these points?
So given the time, I try to do better in my presentation, try to combine some of the points. I see a few issues, also maybe some common elements. One is one comments we also faced when we were in Dhaka, launch report, discuss this with the people there on whether their continued efforts should be focused on Dhaka, and why it should be a national strategy, what's the potential versus focusing on secondary cities. And the second one is, so it's combination and on the secondary city and national strategy part. Second one is on labor market, which Amar mentioned also. In the meet, I also mentioned, this is perhaps not enough discussion about land market, labor market, and even capital market for it worse. And the third one is, kind of going back to just stimulating example on Puxi versus Pudong, and how we think about the two, and what's the sequence, what's the history there, and. That's the 4 questions I think I can try to address with my capacity, and looking forward to more discussion afterwards. In terms of the first one, we do realize the primacy of Dhaka undeniably, and also part of it, as we mentioned in the report, is because its capital status, is because of political economy and some favorable policy. But at the same time, as I emphasized in my presentation, Dhaka's size and its growth, its productivity also driven by good economic fundamentals, right? It's located in a good place, although it suffers from flooding, but the whole country suffers from flooding. It's actually started on a relatively high elevated land and have a very good accessibility compared to other cities. So it's not undeniable. And build on that, the agglomeration effects naturally take place, and talented people, high-skilled people, low-skilled people, and both self-select into the city and make this a bigger conglomerate. So that's one. And also with that, Indermit unfortunately hasn't visited Dhaka. I mentioned that he feels Dhaka may not be as dense if you compare to other cities in the region, which is true, but actually the density of West Dhaka is about 41,000 people per square kilometer. It's one of the highest in the world. So it's really dense if you walk around. And again, if you walk around there, it's not comparable to Puxi of Shanghai. It has a nice tradition and setup of bond of French concession and a long history. Basically, most of part of the city you couldn't travel around. 2 hours average, wasted on traffic congestion in the city. You saw it in the video. And so welcome you to visit, Dhaka to experience the messiness, presented there. And with that, also in the report, we present the importance of Dhaka relative to the country. It's the economic powerhouse, account for based on how you estimate 20 to 30% of the country's economy. So if Dhaka doesn't work, the whole country may not really achieve its aspiration, regardless what should be done about secondary cities. And of course, in parallel, efforts should be made to improve secondary cities. And the experience from other cities in the region, like Delhi, we also have an image comparing Delhi and Dhaka. The two cities, the two metropolitan areas are of similar size. Dhaka is actually bigger, 18 million. Delhi is smaller, 17 billion. But Delhi is much more vibrant if you measure in terms of light, and its vibrancy spill over to nearby cities and other secondary cities, all the way connected to cities across the border in Pakistan. It's really impressive. But Dhaka doesn't have that capacity, doesn't have that spillovers. So that's we felt, still emphasize needed to be focused on this city, which can represent the country to conduct into dialogue with other global cities. So that's the first question. And a second on the labor market and the land market. And again, I couldn't get into detail about this model. So this model, of course, I have a lot of assumptions, but it's really consider how the different parts of the city interact with each other through land market, through labor market, and through housing market. So the interactions is built into the model. And I really like the question that Amar raised on even East Dhaka is developed, perhaps most likely it will be, still be driven a combination of private investment in housing for middle-income countries and some commercial development. Then how about accessibility to jobs by the poor, by the lower-income people? What we saw in the simulation is that after you build this embankment, the land become available and more jobs will emerge in East Dhaka. And then on top of that, if you develop mass rapid transit, including the designed rapid transit lines and mass rapid transit lines, people live outside East Dhaka have much better accessibility to East Dhaka itself and to jobs even in West Dhaka, because you connect the East and the West. And we saw another point I didn't mention is the housing. We model it as both low-income housing and high-income housing. Low-income housing can only build more by crowding in, and high-income housing can build up. So we saw those low-income housing emerge more along the transit north, and so people may live relatively outside of East Dhaka, but do have accessibility because mass transit built ahead of the time. That's come to the point that if you don't act in advance, and those right-of-ways for bus rapid transit and mass rapid transit will be taken over by private development. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to get into Pudong and Puxi, but one small element I want to add to this discussion is that between the period that Indermit mentioned, the 1950s and the 1990s, Puxi was the economic powerhouse of China, despite the low income level of China. And it's so critical for the country. It's politically sensitive if reforms directly implement there, like the land market, because the land market is absent everywhere in the country, not just in Pudong, also in Puxi. How you address those issues, how you start retrofitting without thinking of land. So those issues need to be tested somewhere, and the country choose the Pudong because its geographical location, close to Puxi, but at the same time it's relatively absent, doesn't have much vested interest, so they can experiment those innovative policies at the time. So I think that's one element I wanted to add to the historical discussion of Shanghai, in terms of broader discussion.
I want to turn in a moment to questions from the room, but Amar, you've worked a lot on transport issues, and the idea that providing the transport creates connectivity to the existing population centers, whether it's West Dhaka or any other city, but that also raises rent costs along the side of that transport route, which seems to me limits accessibility for poor people to the jobs and the housing. How does that get balanced typically, or what are the solutions that people need to take into account?
I think this is, the whole discussion we're having here is like a classic sort of technical versus political issue, right? So there's a technical solution, but then there's the political reality or the governance reality. The report talks about land administration as well. My experience, as I think you alluded to, Chaz, was doing this impact evaluation of the Lahore bus rapid transit. I think the first thing that, going back to the politics versus the technical, is like many other cities in South Asia, Lahore had this massive master plan for years and years where, they said we'll build 6 or 7 lines, there'll be mass transit, light rail, this and that. Technical consultants came, did the transport modeling, and it was there. But something happened in 2012, about 10 months before the general election, where the chief minister of the Punjab, who then later, they won the election as well, decided that they really wanted to go ahead and build the Lahore BRT. So they basically imported contractors, service providers, and in a record time of about 10 months, they put together a 27-kilometer line. We did an impact evaluation on that. Basically, we tried to understand how, a household that was living on the metro line versus a matched household which did not get the BRT line, how did their economic trajectories change 5 years out? And what we found was, not surprisingly, that the creation of the BRT in itself, without any changes in the land use regulations, actually increases density and land prices go up. Obviously, there's the whole politics behind that. Who owns that land? Who knew that this is going to happen, and so on. But then we also saw that the market responds in very incredible ways. For example, my mind keeps going back to this example where a gentleman who owns a business in the center of the city and lives in the suburb told me that because his girls were going to college in the close to his shop, one of the big burdens on his time every day was to take his 2 daughters to college, then go back to work, pick them up and drop them back. But now he said that there are these rickshaw services which basically take them 6 kilometers to the nearest metro stop, and they can travel to the college safely and back. So the point I'm making is that once an infrastructure is built up, the market kind of reacts and things happen around that. One thing that hasn't happened in Lahore, and I know has happened in other places, Singapore and others, is the government trying to make use of the windfall gains that come with the building of these pieces of infrastructure. So when I think of the retrofitting option, of course, it's easier said than done, but one way of subsidizing the public value from infrastructure is to find ways for a government to capture some of the land value that's inevitable and try to reinvest it into the system. And ideally, if that can be coordinated with land use regulations, if you can create some kind of, for example, zones around the metro stations like gold, platinum, etc., and expect developers to come and pay a premium to be able to construct on that. I think that will be a great option as well. But again, it all depends on the politics. It depends on the land use and who owns the land.
Yue, I sorry to go back to Dhaka, but Dhaka has the 2 mayors. This report wasn't done in secret. What's been their reaction, involvement to your thinking?
So one little aspect.
I loved it.
Sorry, yeah. One little bit background to that is both mayors, their constituency was traditionally only cover West Dhaka. So only in 2016, their constituency expanded to East Dhaka. So it indicates the government desire to also develop the East, but also shows the limitation. Right, so most of their voters, like 8 million out of 9 million, live in West Dhaka. So when we talk with them about these ideas, they don't have much thinking for East Dhaka because they are busy with retrofitting or even fix small things, in fact, in West Dhaka. So that shows another aspect of the governance challenge that Martin didn't mention in retrofitting was starting anew. Because in starting anew, although you may lack a governance institution right now, but there is a possibility to purposely build institution to help implement some of the new ideas, while the existing one are preoccupied with existing.
I have been to Bangladesh and to Dhaka many times, so I have lots of questions, but I want to give other people a chance to make comments or ask questions. We have microphones, and if you raise your hand, we will give you one. If you could tell us who you are and if you're from an organization that's not shut down, you could acknowledge that. But also ask a question or make a point briefly so lots of people have an opportunity.
Hi. Good morning. I'm Steve Anlian with ECODIT, an alum of the Urban Institute. Not to be provocative, but the scenario of Dhaka that you've used, is it building anew or retrofitting? And the reason I ask that from an urban planning perspective is both Shanghai and in this case Dhaka are unique in that they had underdeveloped or undeveloped adjacent lands within the city limits. That's unusual. That's unique. When I think of retrofitting, I think of intensification and densification of a city that permits growth. In many ways, this is building anew. So what's the answer? Is it building anew or retrofitting? The case study of Dhaka.
Anyway, that's such a short and direct question. I mean, and I missed that chapter when I read the report. But what else would you need to know to answer that question?
Not anything else. I think again, it's a unique opportunity. We admit that, right? So it's close to this your CBD, you have a valuable land. But so for Dhaka, we recommend starting anew, and so that's kind of the suggestion and the thinking, but also how to strategically implementing the starting a new vision. For other cities, broadly, I think Shirley-Andrew has some good studies to suggesting, urban population will increase very fast, continue to increase very fast, especially in South Asian countries. So ultimately, you need new floor space to accommodate those population. And in his book, he recommended, thinking about starting anew, where of course you're doing retrofitting efforts to improve the existing part because urban population is increasing fast. So that's perhaps a broader answer to the question.
If there are other questions, I want to collect them, but I'm thinking about even in the U.S. as cities grew, there was, over the last century, just very controversial efforts to figure out what is the boundary of the city. And so, in the U.S. at least, local government policies set state by state, but different state laws that allow consolidation or expansion or even overlapping functional responsibilities, so regional water districts or transport districts, et cetera, that basically try to resolve this governance issue so that the footprint of what we're talking about is matched politically. And so I'll be interested as things develop to see how this expansion of the electoral map for Dhaka actually affects interest in the development of East Dhaka. There was a question somewhere. Yes.
Thank you so much. Roberta Romano from the International Organization for Migration, IOM. Last year at the World Urban Forum in Malaysia, there was a lot of discussion about community-driven, community-led urban planning. So it seemed to be very trendy and a bit romantic as an idea. So based on your experience, both for Dhaka and also broader, is this, I've not read the report, so I apologize if this is already addressed, but how much communities were consulted within the planning of your different scenarios? If that's not the case, whether you plan to include community contributions to be inputted within the plan, or whether the bottom-up approach is actually not effective, or maybe looking at a more rational approach that looks at previous case studies that have been successful would probably be what you would suggest. So, thank you.
So let's collect the second question right here on the aisle, and then we'll.
Thank you so much. My name is Emile Achew from GICAD International. I'm very interested of urban governance as far as Dhaka is concerned. I will appreciate to have some information about how far civil society, grassroots, are involved in urban development project in Dhaka. Thank you.
So, do you want to start, and we'll give others a chance to chime in as well?
How much did you consult civil society?
Yeah, so basically, again, our study, so the idea of interventions is based on existing plans. Some of those plans, go through the consultation with the community. Others perhaps not, because that's one limitation of those existing studies. They were kind of developed with foreign, consultants. And I think in implementing the general suggestion we made here, we definitely would recommend the government to consult with the communities and take a more grassroots approach, if I can add to that. But as Chas mentioned, this report is focused on the vision, focused on the trade-offs potential, didn't address all the questions.
Deirdre, do you have anything on these points?
I was just going to make one point, and again, mine goes back to what's happening in Lahore right now. As soon as you say national priority, it kind of says we're going to do this one way or the other. It is a bigger strategic objective for the country, talking about big corridors. I think there's an inherent issue with local communities because people will be displaced. When you think of an image like this, what we have in the background, even if you build up with a sort of an elevated route, there is a lot of areas or communities that will be affected. So I think being maybe a little bit cynical, in theory, there's never going to be a perfect way where the community is going to come in and say, sure, you can just knock everything down and put us 10 kilometers away. It's just not going to happen. But I think in the case of Lahore, for example, there is a Supreme Court involvement now where the case was made by civil society that one of the elevated routes was going very close to Chauburji, which is a 16th century monument from the Mughal era. And their comment was, it's just 300 feet away from it. It kind of ruptures the whole sort of image of the city. So it goes back to this question, the point that Indamit was making about livability, about how pleasant a place is, because, like it or not, these elevated BRTs are not pretty things when you have, 16th century monuments in the middle of the city. Imagine building these elevated routes all over Paris, it would just ruin the whole city. So I think there is a very difficult mix here when it comes to development partners, difficult decisions for government. Of course, building underground, as we have in this city and others, is extremely expensive, perhaps prohibitively expensive. We already had a $15 billion bill on this in these recommendations, and I can't imagine how much more expensive it will become. So unfortunately, I say that as much as governments should try to do that, it's a very difficult nut to crack.
So actually, Mike, I guess that the only comment I have on this one is that we are thinking about these sort of two things. The first one is a top-down kind of an approach, which we associate with the Chinese. And basically because they could do it because the Chinese government owns all the land, etc. Right? And then you've got this sort of bottom-up approach, which is much more sort of, which is essentially much more consultative and so on. And I think that in South Asia, it has tended to be mostly that, right? But there's something in the middle too, which is essentially a market-driven approach in the sense that you actually use market forces as well to actually help you along. And I think in South Asia, one has to strengthen that as well. So then you'll have all three of these things. You'll have a top-down, you'll have a bottom-up, but then you'll have something in the middle that also connects. And you don't want to leave that tool. You don't want to leave that tool underutilized or unutilized. And I think that, in a sense, is my sort of main discomfort with the report. Not the way that you started the report. The way that you started the report is actually very consistent with this approach, but the way you ended it, right? I think it ended up being much more sort of top-down-ish, right? Now, and the thing that you always worry about is that in creating a place like Shanghai, you might end up creating a place like New Orleans, where you end up getting a flood and so on, because and while in the US you could recover from something like that, in the case of Bangladesh, it could take you decades to recover, right? I guess even over here it has taken decades, but there it could take a century to recover from a big flood like that. That's one thing, right? So that would be my only thing. Now, the way that I would reconcile the Chinese approach and the approach that one might work in Bangladesh would be that you don't call it the Pudong approach, you call it the Shanghai approach. And then you're talking about a very different approach. You're not talking about just building anew and so on. You're actually talking about both retrofitting as well as building anew at the same time. And I think that one of the ways, you keep talking about, I guess we all keep talking about the fact that one has to capture some of the increase in the value of land. Well, the way you do that is usually by creating a good land market and having the price reflect the value of that land. That's perhaps, it's not the most equitable way, but it's the fairest way.
I think I want to just add a little bit on the land part, which we touched upon. I think it's quite relevant to both the questions. So basically, in the report, we do recommend the government to be aware of how the windfall gains will fall with the development of East Dhaka, and to set up the institution for land market ahead of the time. And starting with basic land titling, clarify who owns the land in the existing in East Dhaka part, because mostly it's supposed to belong to farmers, and those will help address some of the equity concerns. At the same time, for the government to be able to later on reallocate some of the significant gains from land rent and to mitigate some of the concerns. That's one point. Yeah.
As I've been listening to our conversation, it strikes me that this report has accomplished a lot. It hasn't solved all the problems, which take time and take collaboration across lots of actors. So before we end, I want to give you a chance to sort of summarize what are the main uses of policymakers for the model you've developed, which is an advance and uses a lot more data and analysis than some prior efforts. But before we get to that, let me take a couple more questions. One here and then one here.
Hi, I'm Dhruv, previously with the Brookings Institution, India. Thank you for your report. I really also agree with bringing the community on board for adoption and implementation purposes. But my question is very simple. So what, in your opinion, should you prioritize? You talked about transport a little bit and about embankments. What would yield the maximal returns for growth in East Dhaka?
Thank you for that. A question on the aisle here.
Good morning. I'm Nilufar Ahmed. I am from Dhaka city. I grew up in a beautiful green city which become right now a man-made disaster, a total nightmare. I came to this event to learn whether there is any actually hope for Dhaka. I did not read the report, but you mentioned like three major risks doing the renew in the east side. One is because it was a floodplain, basically, it needs to capture all the rainwater, other Dhaka will be flooded, and it floods every year. And the secondly, the labor market. Most of the labor that comes to Dhaka actually come from that area. And the third area you did not mention, it actually provides a huge amount of fresh vegetables, fruit, and fish for consumption in Dhaka city as well. Given that Bangladesh is such a land-poor country, one need to think about that, how are we going to feed the urban population? My question is right now that the two mayors, one mayor is non-existent, the mayor of the North Dhaka died, very, very weak. Dhaka being the capital, it is the seat of the all-powerful Prime Minister. And there is the urban task force actually under the Prime Minister's office. So did the World Bank actually had any engagement with the Prime Minister's office? If any decision is done on Dhaka, it has to be moved from the Prime Minister's office. So I would like to know that. Thanks.
That's a good question. I'm sorry, was there one last question that we can collect? So yes, back here.
Good questions.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Paul Cadario. I used to work at the World Bank and was part of the group that worked in the late 80s with Shanghai. So I have some, and I've been to Dhaka. I think that the last woman has put her finger, and I've been to China, I go every year. I think the woman who just spoke has put her finger on it. You have to have, the political economy includes vision. And Shanghai is very special, very urban, and has a lot of really good engineers and planners. It always did, as you pointed out. So I'm wondering, from the point of view of capacity, what the dialogue with Bangladesh was, whether it was a civil society, whether it was with good, smart engineers and planners, or whether it was with visionaries in the Prime Minister's office. Because that, it would seem to me, is key. The other thing is, Shanghai has developed the way it is over the last 30 years, modern Shanghai. What's the time frame? And I don't think anyone mentioned is this Shanghai 2050, is it Shanghai 2070? And to what extent do you look at other cities in Asia as perhaps giving some indication of where Dhaka might go? Thank you.
a lot there. Yue, do you want to lead off?
Sure, maybe I
Questions
start.
of where do you start? Transport or embankments?
So many. So I maybe start with the last one on the time frame, which I failed to mention. So we're aiming at about 20 years between 2016 and to 2035. So the simulation and is based on that. And that why we pick that time frame is because most of the existing new plans and visions for Dhaka aim at that frame. So the Dhaka structure plan is between that period. The revised strategic transportation plan is between that period. We modified them based on what's the implementation speed of previous plans in our simulation. So it's, again, a lot in the report. Welcome to read the details. And the second, I guess, is on both the last two, audience ask how we're thinking this idea, this vision can be communicated and conveyed to the leaders, and that's I really like the last audience that's why the Shanghai Pudong aspirational example is really powerful and relevant here, because again, as I mentioned, Pudong is a national taken as a national strategy, not just to develop that area, to implement policies for Shanghai, but also to elevate the whole Yangtze River actually at the end, lead to development of the whole country. So that's why it's a national strategy, and we want to motivate that the East Dhaka idea of vision, by being in this aspect. So and then. Perhaps we're relatively successful, and a subtle way to answer the question is our report have already over 1 million download online, and much of it is from Bangladesh itself. So people care about their city, care about their capital city, care about the fate of their country, and want to learn what are the potentials and possibilities, and want to maybe through that way. And also the purpose of today's discussion to kind of feedback to the country leaders.
I guess to the extent that the existing governance routines in Bangladesh produce levels of inequality or limit access to decision making in ways that we're all familiar with. And the issue is, I guess, in some respects, whether the model and the insights it delivers inform that in a way that improves at some marginal way, so that the trade-off between having a prime minister who has to approve everything and whatever equity gets ignored in the course of that versus having decision-making dispersed and not moving ahead anywhere. We're up on our time, so I want to give you a chance if you've got any concluding thoughts or where this goes next.
Okay, inside the bank, actually our implementation team or operational team are thinking of concrete ways to developing East Dhaka together with Retrofitting West, and also developing other satellite towns inside of the metropolitan area. With that, I'm hoping the vision and can be implemented, and the future of Dhaka is great.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Yue, for being at the front of this huge report and doing such a good job explaining it to us and discussing it, but also Amar Malik and Indrajit Gill and Martin Rama on the video for reading it and commenting on it. For those of you who have not read it, I've read it now twice, and it gets better and in more detail each time. This is really a tour de force, even if it doesn't solve all of Dhaka's problems in one go. So thank you for attending. Those of you online, thank you. And again, Yue particularly, thank you so much.
Thank you.